The case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia presents a stark intersection of national sovereignty, judicial mandate, and international cooperation dynamics. Following his deportation from the United States, characterized as wrongful, Abrego Garcia, a citizen of El Salvador, found himself incarcerated within a notorious Salvadoran prison known for housing gang members. Despite a United States Supreme Court ruling directing the Trump administration to facilitate his return, a significant impasse emerged. Senior officials within the Trump administration asserted that, owing to Abrego Garcia's Salvadoran citizenship, the United States possessed no authority over his disposition once he was within El Salvador's borders. Concurrently, President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, recognized as a key partner in U.S. deportation initiatives, stated publicly on Monday that he lacked the presidential power required to compel Abrego Garcia's return to the United States. This confluence of stated executive limitations and judicial directives raises fundamental questions regarding the practical reach of national legal systems and the established boundaries of international jurisdiction. Central to the administration's position is the established principle of national sovereignty. Abrego Garcia's legal status as a Salvadoran citizen places him squarely under the jurisdiction of El Salvador upon his arrival within its territory. This reality, from the perspective articulated by U.S. officials, supersedes the circumstances of his departure from the United States, effectively rendering U.S. influence over his subsequent fate non-existent according to their stated interpretation of international norms. The United States Supreme Court's directive introduces a distinct legal obligation, yet its force operates primarily within the framework of the U.S. government itself. The mandate to facilitate return tasks the administration with undertaking specific actions, but this judicial order does not inherently possess the power to compel a foreign sovereign state, El Salvador, to act against its own stated laws or presidential limitations concerning one of its nationals. President Bukele's declaration regarding the constraints on his authority highlights this very gap between a domestic legal requirement and the realities of international execution. Furthermore, the existing cooperative relationship between the two administrations, while described as vital, was fundamentally constructed around the objective of processing deportations from the United States to El Salvador. This specific focus means the established channels and agreements may lack the necessary mechanisms or political will to address the unprecedented scenario of compelling a return to the United States under these contested circumstances, potentially straining the very partnership it relies upon. Consequently, the immediate operational reality for Kilmar Abrego Garcia is dictated by his situation within the Salvadoran penal system. His incarceration signifies his current status as an individual subject exclusively to Salvadoran law and judicial processes. Any potential release or change in his condition hinges not on the U.S. court ruling concerning his initial deportation, but upon decisions made within the Salvadoran legal or executive sphere, aligning with President Bukele's assertion of limited power in this specific matter. Contrasting sharply with the executive branch's focus on current jurisdiction is the perspective inherent in the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling. The judiciary's determination centers on the process of Abrego Garcia's removal from the United States, finding it flawed and thus mandating remedial action by the U.S. government itself. This places the onus on the administration to rectify a situation originating within U.S. borders, irrespective of the individual's subsequent location or citizenship status from the court's viewpoint. However, this judicial finding runs directly counter to the operational stance adopted by the administration officials involved. Their public statements prioritize the present reality of Abrego Garcia being a Salvadoran national on Salvadoran soil, invoking principles of non-interference in the affairs of a sovereign state regarding its own citizens. This divergence highlights a fundamental tension between a domestic legal obligation to correct a perceived wrong and the internationally recognized boundaries of state authority. Moreover, the portrayal of President Bukele as a cooperative figure in deportation matters clashes with his declared powerlessness in this specific instance. While facilitating the reception of deportees aligns with U.S. objectives, the inability or stated unwillingness to facilitate a return underscores that the partnership likely operates within defined, mutually agreed-upon parameters, that do not extend to compelling the movement of Salvadoran citizens back to the U.S. against Salvadoran procedural constraints. This reveals the specific, perhaps limited, nature of the established cooperation, which does not automatically encompass reciprocal actions of this type. Ultimately, the abstract legal requirement for the U.S. to facilitate return stands in stark contrast to the concrete situation facing Abrego Garcia. He remains physically detained within the Salvadoran system, subject to its laws and detention policies, a tangible reality seemingly unaffected by the U.S. judicial mandate without a corresponding executable mechanism agreed upon by both sovereign nations. Examining the term facilitate itself reveals the operational challenge inherent in the Supreme Court's directive. Facilitation implies enabling or making an action easier, yet in this context, it requires navigating the explicitly stated refusal or inability of the relevant sovereign power, El Salvador, to perform the core action, releasing and enabling the return of its citizen. This suggests that fulfilling the mandate would necessitate diplomatic negotiation, potentially involving concessions or invoking other bilateral agreements, moving far beyond a simple executive instruction. The specific circumstances of Abrego Garcia's detention, placement within a notorious gang prison, further complicates the situation from an operational standpoint. This action by Salvadoran authorities underscores his integration into their domestic security apparatus, reinforcing the perception that his case is now an internal Salvadoran matter. It signals a level of control and classification by El Salvador that makes external influence, particularly from the nation that deported him, exceptionally difficult without formal Salvadoran consent and action. This stalemate carries potential implications for the broader U.S.-El Salvador relationship. While cooperation on deportations has been highlighted, a failure by the U.S. administration to successfully navigate this issue, despite a Supreme Court order, could introduce friction or signal limitations in the partnership's scope when U.S. domestic legal requirements clash with Salvadoran sovereign prerogatives concerning its own citizens. The perception of U.S. influence or the reliability of cooperative frameworks might be subtly altered depending on the outcome. Ultimately, the scenario provides a clear illustration of the practical limits encountered when domestic judicial findings require actions within the sovereign jurisdiction of another nation regarding one of its citizens. The principle of national sovereignty acts as a significant barrier, demonstrating that even a ruling from the highest court in the U.S. may not be directly enforceable abroad without the active, willing participation of the foreign government involved, especially when that government cites limitations within its own legal or constitutional structure. This specific impasse potentially signals broader challenges in addressing cases of erroneous deportation where the individual holds citizenship in the receiving nation. Future instances involving similar jurisdictional conflicts might face comparable hurdles, particularly if receiving countries assert analogous limitations on their executive authority or prioritize sovereign control over their nationals above rectifying deportation errors originating elsewhere. The situation also casts light upon the complexities arising when domestic judicial mandates intersect directly with the conduct of foreign policy, an area traditionally dominated by the executive branch. It underscores the potential for conflict between judicial findings demanding specific international outcomes and the executive's assessment of its practical authority and diplomatic capabilities within the constraints of international law and relations. Furthermore, the case serves as a reminder that bilateral cooperation agreements, even those described as vital, often operate within narrowly defined parameters. Partnership on one specific policy objective, such as facilitating removals from the U.S., does not automatically translate into a binding obligation or even a political willingness to undertake reciprocal or remedial actions that fall outside the original scope, particularly when they touch upon sensitive issues of national sovereignty and citizenship. Consequently, the practical efficacy of domestic legal remedies for actions with transnational consequences becomes questionable when reliant upon the active consent and cooperation of a foreign state that perceives no legal or political basis to comply. The designation of a deportation as wrongful by a national court may offer limited tangible relief for the individual concerned if the sovereign state where they reside asserts jurisdictional primacy and declines or claims inability to participate in the court-ordered remedy. Thus, the situation surrounding Kilmar Abrego Garcia crystallizes the inherent limits of national judicial power when its directives extend beyond domestic borders and encounter the sovereign authority of another state over its own citizen. The distinct positions articulated, the U.S. judiciary mandating facilitation based on the circumstances of removal, the U.S. executive deferring to Salvadoran jurisdiction based on current citizenship and location, and the Salvadoran executive citing constraints on its power to compel return, coalesce into a diplomatic and legal standstill. This leaves the individual subject to the legal processes of the nation asserting jurisdiction, El Salvador, irrespective of the U.S. court's findings regarding the initial deportation. The case serves as a stark illustration of how international cooperation frameworks, even when deemed vital for specific functions like deportation, may not bridge fundamental disagreements rooted in national sovereignty and the perceived internal legal capacities of partner states, ultimately defining the practical boundaries of redress in transnational legal disputes. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, and be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more geopolitical insights like this. I love hearing your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Share this video with anyone interested in deeper perspectives on current events. Until next time, stay informed and think critically. Thank you.